Picture this: girl with an alcoholic mother delves into the supernatural to come to grips with the untimely death of her father. Sounds like a perfect show for the Disney Channel. And in fact, it was. Although for anyone who watched it, probably feels like a fever dream. Was that really on? Did I see what I thought I saw? Which makes its title all the more perfect. So weird. Creator? Tom J. Astle.
Okay, well, the show came about. I was working as a television writer, and my agent got contacted via Henry Winkler's company. There were two people that had pitched an idea to Henry that was basically was one sentence. It was X Files for kids, and X Files back then was a big deal, as many people remember, and so the idea of doing something that was for like Disney Channel or Nickelodeon was their idea, just an X Files for kids, something with paranormal, but with teenage protagonists. So I said, well, that sounds interesting. So, and who's going to turn down a meeting with Henry Winkler? So I went into, I believe his offices at the time were at Disney. And by the way, the very first thing I saw was on the coffee table in the room that we met in. There was a picture of Henry holding a big trout that he had caught. And I'm from Montana and grew up fly fishing. And I immediately said, "Oh, do you fly fish?" And he was like, "Oh," and then, the whole meeting could have been about that from then on, but we did have business to do. And I sort of, we kind of bonded over that because he's been to Montana many times and he's a fisherman. And so that was kind of funny. But the two people that had the idea, just the simple, one sentence idea, X Files for kids, were two people named Alec Griffith and Michelle Davis. And they were in the meeting, and Henry and me, as I recall. And they just said, we just think that there's this opportunity, and Disney Channel's looking to do series, that are outside of the box series for them at the time. They want to, go after the tween audience, which was kind of a new idea for them. They had, most of their programming was skewed much younger, but they wanted to get into the young teenager space a little bit. And so I was like, all right, let me think about it. And one of their kind of marching orders for Disney Channel, at least, was ordinary kids in extraordinary situations. Like that's kind of how they saw themselves. And I knew that. So I thought, well, maybe it's kind of interesting if there's this kid that likes this paranormal stuff. And one of the ways we get around them not being in one town that like literally everything in the town is haunted, is that what if they travel a lot? I hit on the idea, what if her mom is a rock star and they live on the tour bus? So I thought that was kind of interesting and it would be fun to do. And you could have music in the show, opened up casting, that kind of stuff. So I pitched that back to Alec and Michelle and Henry, and they liked it. And we went into Disney Channel, pitched to an executive there named Lee Gaither, who was terrific. And essentially they bought it in the room. He still had to check with his bosses like one always does, but they loved the idea. And so very quickly I was, writing scripts and, a script, the pilot. And the female protagonist is something I pitched without really thinking about it. I liked the idea of this, I guess she was playing a 14-year-old girl, had a older brother, but it was, that's kind of how I always pitched it. And I never got any pushback on that. So at the time anyway, it surprisingly was a non-issue, which is, I don't know if it was prescient on Disney's part or just the way things were at the time. They weren't really thinking about that. I don't know. But no, I never got any kind of, we should make this a boy lead kind of thing. The old adage in children's television, if you went back before then, and probably in some places even then, was that girls would watch boys, but boys wouldn't watch girls. I don't know who made that up, but it's not true. If we had any conversations about it, it was certainly that there was nothing wrong with having a female lead, and especially since what she was doing was cool. She was good at computers. Her mom's this rock star. She was not afraid of this paranormal stuff. So she was I think a good character, and I think that's all they cared about. Or if they had any meetings where they thought about that, I wasn't in them. And none of that trickled down to me. Maybe I was lucky in that at that time, Disney Channel, as I think I said before, kind of hadn't done this. They'd done some made-for-TV movies, which are, they had notes about character and looking back at the show, it's actually much darker than you would think Disney would want. But at the time, they were trying to push into that teenager thing, and so they were very. I remember specifically having conversations about that. To not. They were very concerned that it not skew too young. So as a writer, that was great because the pilot episode is about an actual disaster that happened and a child that dies in it, and it's there's a haunting and there's some really serious conversations, and the main character of Fee and her brother have lost their dad when they were both pretty young. What drives her character is this belief in supernatural things, and at the base of that is her desire to know who her father was and what happened to him really. And her brother is the opposite. He's closed down about that. Like he doesn't like talking about losing his dad because he's a little older and remembers it a little better than she. Fee is only 3 when her father passed away, and Jack is older than her by a couple of years, and so he's the I guess in the X-Files of it all, he's the skeptic and she's the believer. But I remember that in the pilot there's a moment where they're having an argument. The brother and sister are having an argument, and he says he basically doesn't believe, doesn't think any of this is true. And her brother says, when you die, you're gone. That's it. You never come back. Nobody ever sees you again. Words to that effect. And she says, I'll never believe that. And he says to her, it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't change anything. And that's pretty rough for a kid's show, I would argue. But it's also real. There are people who lose parents and children, and how you react to that is a lifelong journey. And so Disney was absolutely, and I'll give some credit to Lee Gaither, the executive I mentioned before. He wanted me to lean into that stuff, and he was an advocate for the show being able to handle topics like that. So I may have been lucky in the notes of it all because Disney was trying to appeal older on purpose and didn't want the show to seem that it was for preschool kids. I remember when we cast Cara DeLizia, hands down the best person for the part. Casting, especially young teens, she was I think 14 when she was cast. If they've done any child acting, it can be tricky because the coaching they get is sometimes to act big, act wide-eyed, act more sitcom-y, because a lot of the roles are in those places, but she didn't do that. She seemed pretty real, and she seemed to handle the emotional stuff, just immediately. I think it was a kind of a no-brainer when she was cast. It was like, oh, this person is good. They're the right one for the part. She had the gravitas from the get-go. She also could have a twinkle in her eye and be funny and tease with her brother. It's like she just seemed real, and but she had a sort of a quality of seriousness about her that we wanted for the character and wanted for the show. And she was just, I don't know, she was just perfect. I think everybody kind of looked at each other and well, I think that's Fee. I think it was that easy.
Showrunner John Cooksey.
Cara had that quality that I love, above all else, above technique, is that she just was so emotional. She just let it all out. And I don't think there's, it's the same with writing a script, right? If you don't bleed on the page, then why are you getting paid? Like if it doesn't cost you anything, then why are you writing? I don't get that. And, she always let it all out for the cameras and really just amazing.
Creator Tom J. Astle.
The whole internet and Fee with her own website, it almost sounds corny to say it, but it was sort of cutting edge for a teenager, and I remember during production it was kind of fun, making up the designs and having, her brother would mess with it sometimes with her, and we actually had discussions. Yeah, but how is she going to get internet if they're on a bus? Because there was no Wi-Fi or cell signals back then, so we had to really think about that. It's like, well, everywhere they stop, she can get the Wi-Fi for, get the signal from the internet from wherever she is. And we just decided that, back then in 1999 or whatever, the internet was not a quick thing. Actual web pages loaded pretty slowly if it had any graphics on them. And we decided, well, let's just not have it be that way. We'll make it like it works quickly. So it sort of future proofed it for at least a couple of years because we sort of skated past some of that so that we could do what we wanted to do, which is make her a modern kid. We really didn't want to have her just, keeping a, dear diary and I'm, thinking out loud and I hate my brother and I wish my dad wasn't gone. Like let's let her be a modern person who is not afraid of technology, and then let that technology interface with the spirit world. The first title was Too Weird, and that's what it was all the way up through when we were shooting. And I remember we were on location somewhere in Vancouver, and the Disney Channel executive Lee came up to me and sat down next to me. We were between takes, and he said, "So we've been doing some looking, and apparently there was this show that already has Too Weird as part of its title. So what do you want to call your show?" And I said, "Well, can I use either of the words?" He said, "Yeah, you just can't call it Too Weird because there's already something called, I believe it was Too Weird: Erie, Indiana, which is a show you may have heard of as well. But in any event, I said, okay. And we were sitting on the steps and, in this location and kind of batted a few things back and forth. And I said, well, what about So Weird? That is so weird because people say that, right? That's sort of a saying. And he's like, okay, I'll go see if I can sell that. And he went back and they're like, yeah, that'll clear. We don't have any conflicts with that. So then it became So Weird.
Showrunner John Cooksey.
But the original tone, or at least the ending of the pilot, was quite light. It was not at all the dark grief and the split between Fee and her brother over how they wanted to handle their grief about their father. The original was more like Casper the Friendly Ghost. And so that was, that's how it came in. And Lee said, yeah, I'm going to take the writer away and we'll be back, and kind of took Tom aside. This is my understanding. And then it came back, that more serious thing. And it was beautiful.
Oh, yeah. Well, sort of a special moment for me on the pilot was near the end when we were shooting the scene in the cemetery that we had created in Stanley Park in Vancouver, in this spot that was just full of these blossoming cherry trees. It was an absolutely beautiful day. And it's the scene at the end of the episode where Jack and Fee, Patrick Levis and Cara Delizia, have been, kind of at each other and gone through some stuff together and said some not always nice things, brother and sister stuff, but finally get to a place where they, especially from Patrick's side, acknowledge that this was a good thing. They've solved the mystery of this boy that was lost in this terrible boating tragedy many years before, and he's now reunited with his family in the afterlife. It's solved the ghost's need in a nice way. And although Patrick doesn't, the character of Jack is not a full believer yet, it's just the first episode, he loves his sister, and they have this moment of you did a nice thing. And I conceived of that scene. I wrote that scene in a story. I wrote it in the script. I did rewrites of that scene. We did it. I saw that scene in casting. I saw that scene in rehearsals, and I finally was seeing it shot. And when it was over, I walked up to Cara and Patrick, and I said to them, "This is the first time I have seen this scene and felt like I was in the audience. And it's because you did it better than I ever imagined it. Up till now, I've been the writer, I've been the producer, and I've just been watching it. Yeah, we got that. But you made me feel like I was just watching these two people, and I thanked them. And it's really true, because none of us makes these things alone. We collaborate with tens, dozens, hundreds of people for all the different things that are required. And when you get a chance to work with other artists, especially talented ones, even though these were just a couple of teenagers, they were good at their craft already, and they made it more than what I had written on the page. And that's the joy of this business, is when you can have a collaboration and it becomes more than the sum of its parts. So I kind of, I kept pinching myself all the way through. I felt very lucky. I will always have a special place in my heart for the pilot of So Weird, because I had those moments on this show, and I'm grateful for them. there's the joke that almost all Disney movies have a dead parent in them, but they don't really deal with that in most of them. At least they didn't back then, and our show did. So I think that's kind of cool. So Weird kind of hit a sweet spot in time where the themes and the subject matter could be a little bit less Disney than most people would expect. Well, a couple of things happened. First of all, the story of my work on the show is a little complicated. It's not complicated. It's a little different than as is typical. As I said, Disney Channel hadn't been doing these kind of shows before that. They once So Weird was up and running, it was that, and Jet Jackson was kind of ran alongside it. But in any case, so I shoot the pilot of So Weird up in Vancouver, and we post it pretty quickly. And I go back up for the final mix. We get all done. And we shot it in early spring. There's a scene in a graveyard full of cherry blossoms. It was late March into early April. We finished it pretty quickly, and then I said to the folks at Disney Channel, okay, so here it is. What do you think? And they said, well, we're meeting internally, or we still, there's still budget things we're trying to figure out. I said, okay, but I'm a working writer, and working is the key part because I have a family. If you're going to pick up the show, or even think that you are, tell me ahead of time, because if I don't know by late May, that's hiring season in my world of network television. But Disney Channel doesn't have a season like network television, so they didn't really understand that. And I kept pushing. I would say, I'm going to go out and start having meetings. If you want me to be able to continue, I need to at least get some hints. And they're like, no, we just tested it. It tested really great, but we think we're going to test it again. So they were hesitant. They were trying to figure out, are we going to really do shows like this? Are we going to do this show? How much can we? They were having budget conversations with Henry's company, I'm sure, and the folks up in Vancouver. But what happened is they didn't decide to pick it up until, I don't know, summer or something. And by then I was like, okay, well, I got an offer to work on a show called Brothers Keeper. And then they picked up the show, but I couldn't be there day to day. So that's when they hired Ali Matheson and John Cooksey to be the showrunners up there, because I literally wasn't available. But they were great. And, one of the things that I did when I named the characters, and also just in terms of what I liked about it, was there was kind of a little bit of an Irish thing to it. It had a lot of the names of the characters, like, Molly and Fiona, and have kind of that lilt to them. And so John and Ali kind of really ran with that. They used banshees, and they used, will-o'-the-wisp. And so they kind of used a lot of Celtic mythology in the show. And, I gave notes. I saw all the cuts. I wrote like their Halloween one, for the next year. And so I worked on it, but I wasn't there for shooting all the time. I just couldn't be. I had another job.
We were recruited. I think we were still working on Rugrats, and Rugrats came to an end for us that year. But anyway, we were contacted by a guy named Lee Gaither, who was the development executive at Disney Channel at the time. They were, really gung ho about, this show, and we looked at, we were thought, oh, Disney Channel, I don't know. We'd been doing kid stuff, and I don't know if we want to do more of that. We didn't really know what it was. And he gave us a tape of the pilot. We went home and watched it, and it was great. Tom Hestel wrote it, and Sean Levy directed. And, it took us by surprise when we watched the pilot, because it was quite dark. The scene with the gimbaled floor where she's sliding down the floor, and that stuff was genuinely scary. And it was based on a real incident, which was, notable, I thought.
The boating disaster that is referenced in the pilot episode is a real disaster that happened, and a whole bunch of people drowned. It was real tragic. And as part of the research, I wanted to see, because we needed Fee to have looked this up as part of her, investigation of the mystery of what happened to this ghost, of this little boy that she'd seen. So I wanted to see what pictures might have existed from the time. I don't have it in front of me, so I don't remember the exact date. There were, in fact, photographs, and some of them are quite dramatic, as you would imagine. So we were going to use those, and we had to get permission to get clearance to use those photographs so that we could include them in the website that Fee is looking up. And there was one photograph that showed a rescue worker, a fireman, I believe, and he's holding the body of a child just draped in his arms, and he looks, absolutely bereft, as you can imagine. It's a real photograph of a real tragedy, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks, because there's a very famous picture from the Oklahoma City bombing of a rescue worker, might have even been a fireman, I don't remember, holding, a deceased child in the very same way. And it just, one of the people who was helping me with research said, "We found this picture. What do you think? Should we put it on her website?" And I was like, absolutely not. But when I saw that real picture of that real person, and it wasn't just people from far away and a half capsized boat, which is, a little less present, I was like, this wasn't me talking as a Disney person saying, that's too rough for Disney. I was like, no, that's an invasion of those people's privacy. And even though they're not, that the child was not alive and that person's not alive anymore, it's like we can't put that on the air. That's not right.
Also, Lee wanted to do a lot of things, I think. I don't think he just wanted to do one thing. And he developed Even Stevens. He developed the comedies, right? When he was there, and Jet Jackson. But he also wanted to do something that was this. He wanted to do not a dark show. Specifically, he wanted to do an X-Files for kids, for teens, right? That was genuinely scary and mysterious. So we were like, okay. And he would go to his executive meetings every week, right? And they'd say, well, who are you going to get to run So Weird? And he would say, oh, I want Cooksey and Matheson. And they'd say, well, we don't want them. They're animation writers. And he'd say, okay. And then the next week he'd come back and they'd say, who are you going to get? And he'd say, Cooksey and Matheson. And we don't want them. They're animation writers. And then finally time ran out. He hired us anyway. And I think it was the combination of Rugrats being definitely a co-viewing show, which was very important to him. He wanted parents and the kids that would become young millennials to watch together, because the story of a single mom was very personal to him. And then we had also done an Outer Limits, I think. So our resume was super weird. It was co-viewing young kid animation and this weird dark sci-fi thing. So in our minds, and in Lee's mind, I guess that made us perfect. So we signed on to write it in LA. It was going to be shot in Vancouver. And we went to the Disney Channel and got an office and started hiring freelancers and writing scripts. And then at the last moment, they changed their mind and said, no, you have to go to Vancouver. And we were so mad because our daughter, Mariel, was 5 at the time and was going to go on to school. Disney doesn't care about children, and sent us to Vancouver. And it was stunning. So as soon as we got there, we were like, oh, okay, this is fine. So that's where we stayed. Yeah, I planned everything out. I planned out, I don't remember how many episodes, at least 3. And the arc with, with the aliens and stuff like that, and how that intertwined with Star and the Roswell episode and things. Those were all part of an arc that continued on and was to be completed in season 3. So I planned everything in advance. The first year we just did 12 more because the pilot already existed. And then the second season we did 26. And I had all those planned out well in advance of the season. Most of them were written. Fee knows something from the start, instinctually as a character, and that is that, inside everything that looks like a monster is probably, some pain that needs to be reached and loved. So therefore, she understands that doing good in the world is a dilemma, because if you fix something, you break something else. And it's become a tenet of my writing that a hero understands that dilemma and is willing to suffer the damage themselves so that they can improve someone else's life. And Fee was the first embodiment of that. The idea of, losing her father and that grief, I don't want to tell Lee's story, but, I very much wanted a wish fulfillment thing in the end, right? I wanted her to be able to re-meet her father in some meaningful way and maybe right the wrong that had been done. And Lee agreed, yes, let's delve deeply into grief, because so many kids have lost a parent or their parents' marriage or whatever it is they're grieving. But young kids and teenage kids obviously have lost a lot, and we both wanted to speak to that. He didn't think that it's good to send a message that if your parent dies, you can get that parent back. because that's not going to happen. But I felt like, this is Wushel when kids know the difference between, reality and fantasy. And, the idea that her father was actually dangling out there and in some sense reachable was, so incredibly compelling. I thought that, it was definitely worth pursuing. And we did actually get there, a little bit in Twin, which was our last episode.
Demons come from every side. In the darkness is the light. Out of the shadows of my life. In the darkness is the light. In the darkness is the light. Surrender will win the fight. These girls walk on fire and ice, but I come out on the other side of paradise.
I wrote the lyrics. And Marie Montague wrote the music. In the Darkness was about Molly's being an alcoholic and a sober alcoholic, which was not something we really ever said out loud. I think it was something that was, fit the show nicely, and it said a lot without saying it out loud. So that was just a sort of an outgrowth of 12-step principles, I would say. There's no way out but through. You have to go through whatever it is, and that's the only way to get to the other side of it. You can't go around it. You can't go back. So that was where In the Darkness of the Light came from. And for everybody, it was kind of a no-brainer. We didn't have a theme song at that point. I had written it for, I don't remember which episode, 4 or 5 or 6 or something, somewhere in there. And you were only going to hear a bit of it ever because she was composing things, or she was in a club, I think, playing that one. Anne Marie used to sit and videotape herself playing guitar, and then she would just sing it and play guitar, and then she would send me these tapes. And, pretty much every time it was like, oh my God. Yeah, that was one of those moments for sure. And In the Darkness and the Light it was all there. I mean, she later re-recorded it with, drums and musicians and stuff like that. And that's what you hear on the show. But, as soon as Lee heard it, he was like, okay, well, we need whatever it was, a 30-second version of that. So we went back and we recut a 30-second version, and that became the theme song.
When Kara left the show after season 2, because it's quite a grind for a kid to do a television series. We did 13 episodes of the first season, which wasn't so bad, but 26 the second season, which back in those days, nowadays, it's very typical to have a streaming show that's 6 or 8 episodes long, or 10 maybe. But in the days of network television, you got an initial order of 13, and then you try to get your back 9 to do 22, and you might get extended to 26 if you're lucky. That's a lot of work, and so I think she was not tired of maybe, but just plain tired, and wanted to, move on to other things. And so she did. And so we didn't recast her part. We cast a different character for season 3. And that's when Alex Johnson was cast for the character of Annie. I wrote a new pilot. Initially the discussion was, okay, well, if Fee's not in the show, is it, and by the end of the second season, she's been through a lot. So you kind of buy that she would want to go be a normal kid. And that was kind of the reality of the actor as well, by the way. So if that's true, the life on the road thing being hard and all of the sort of emotional stuff that she'd been through, do we just continue the show and let the show be more about her brother? But it sort of felt unbalanced, it's not that Patrick Levis wasn't a good actor and good character, and we all really like him. It's that it just felt like there was a hole there. I don't know. Disney, I think at that point, had liked that there was a female lead in the show, and felt that taking that away wouldn't be right. And so I said, well, let's think about, long lost sister doesn't really work, but we have an opportunity to bring in a family friend kind of thing who wants the same experience, and because she's interested in music, and they really liked that because more music made them happy. We were kind of casting a wide net in that way, just looking for somebody who could at least sing, if not play an instrument. And so Alex Johnson definitely could sing, and so that's the route we took. So there were a lot of conversations about it, but ultimately it was let's not just cast a different, they're not going to be two Darrens. We're not going to, that was cast aside first. Nobody really liked the idea of just having her leave and never filling that void. And then we thought, well, let's just write a completely new character who fills that role, but is a different person, but is still, interested in the sort of paranormal normal stuff that the Fee character was. Kara did the first episode of season 3, sort of the handoff. John and Allie, they were running things at that point, at least through season 2, and the whole intent was always to get to a place where Fee solves the mystery of her dad to some degree, and her brother finally comes to terms with believing that this stuff is real, and that because he's sort of a push the feelings way down kind of kid. And in a way, if the show had ended at the end of season 2, I think that would have been satisfying, because it would have felt that the characters had not moved on, but moved. They had gotten to a place where the thing that was their primary emotional stress had been confronted, dealt with, and accepted up to a point. Not that it doesn't make the death go away, it doesn't make the sadness go away, but the idea that the brother and sister had kind of reached a place where they saw eye to eye a little bit more. But Fee was exhausted, and I believed it was okay for her to step down at that point, step aside, because she felt like she'd finally made that connection that she'd never had because she'd lost her father so young. So season 3 kind of went back to a little more episodic, sort of takes turns a little more with characters in the sense of, like Patrick gets to perform a little bit, a lot more music in the show. Alex performs quite a bit. The show has a tonal shift that is partly a result of Disney wanting a tonal shift. They wanted to lighten the show, both emotionally and literally. But it also was, I think, a reflection of the journey that the characters had already gone through. And when Fee leaving the show kind of did that, it sort of said, it's not that we don't have these things out there, these mysteries, these unknown things that force us to confront, what we believe and don't believe. But the hardest one of those has been dealt with to the extent that living humans can deal with it. We've kind of done the dark stuff, I guess would be a simplistic way of putting it, where they wanted supernatural, but they didn't want family history dark, dealing with the death of a parent. First of all, that would have been repetitive. And then the show, that third season, was run by John Mandel and Bruce Zimmerman, who were really nice guys. And John and Bruce, who came up with the sort of spirit animal, Black Panther thing, that because of her travels, she had this encounter, that she had this, protector creature spirit that followed her. And so that was about, so the arc there was mostly unraveling sort of the mystery of how that came about. But that's the kind of mystery that is an interesting mystery, as opposed to it's not quite the emotional journey that season 1 and 2 were for Fee. It was a successful show, and like I said, they wanted to get 3 seasons out of it. So even when Kara wanted to leave, they were pretty adamant that they were like, no, we want to do another full season. We want to get to our number 65 so that we can keep showing these, because they were fans. So internally, I mean, the Disney Channel folks.
I was editing Shelter at that time, and I think Shelter was like number 24 out of 26 or something like that. And we had sort of gotten the message along the way that they wanted it to be funnier, and we'd always felt that there was comedy in it. But in the end of the season, we sort of veered into, we did Troll, which was a funnier episode, and then Shelter. I was with the editor, Judy Griselier, and Shelter is the one where she and this other guy both turned into dogs. And so John Poser, the director, had just had a crazy time. These dogs just ran everywhere, right? They did what, they were sort of trained, but they did a lot of dog stuff. And so when we got to the editing room, the dialogue that I had written didn't necessarily match the action. And the dogs did funny stuff. They tripped over the door on the way going into the house and stuff. So in the editing room, I just started rewriting all the voiceover to match exactly what the dogs were doing. And then, of course, when Kara and the other actor came in, they would they were moving their bodies like the dogs, right? So you got this sense that the dogs were actually, having this ESP conversation, and it was hilarious. Like we were laughing ourselves silly in the editing room, and then we got this call, "Hi, you've been discontinued," and it was kind of like, oh, that was sad. Really, there's a really funny episode on the way. Wait, you should watch it before you get rid of us.
So, what would have happened if John Cooksey and Allie Marie Matheson were not replaced for season 3? We'll get to that. But first, some backstory to remind you of the show's narrative thread.
Well, the whole thread, I planned it to a degree, and then it evolved to a degree. And we wanted to do the funny episode about Gremlins that brought in the character Tad Raxall, and because that actor, who's great, was funny, and we wanted to have him back, and he was old, right, by our standards as a guest star. So it was like, well, what are we going to do with him because he's old, right? And so we had him have a huge crush on Molly, which was very cute and very sort of kid-like, right? He's a very kid-like character, and but he also gave us this option of having incredible technology that we didn't really have to explain. We could just say, yeah, this is the best technology in the world. When Fee's in the barn with her laptop and there's no Ethernet cable, that's fine because Tad Roxall is her friend, and pretty soon there'll be wireless internet, so this will be fine. So the intersection of the aliens coming to visit in the second episode, and they kind of miss them. They leave before they can see them. Then gave rise, that sort of intertwined a bit with Tad Raxall, and that came back in the episode called Listen, that was about the wheat that had been given psychotropic properties. And the idea being that this wheat, when you eat it, allows you to hear other people's thoughts, but the people that speak the Fee are the aliens, right? They say, listen. And that eventually led to Roswell and the device where which was really about, if you see a homeless person talking to themselves, remember they're somebody's brother, they're somebody's son, or, remember they're human beings, but also maybe they're not crazy, right? Maybe there's a reason, and this guy is listening to this device that he found translate human language into alien, and so he could never quite understand it. And that gets left with Fee on the bedside table, and then the aliens come in and they say she's almost ready, and then season 3 was Contact.
And now, season 3. What would have been?
And the idea was that Fee would go to Tad Raxall, who would reverse the SETI array, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence array of satellite telescopes, and make it into a transmitter. And she would use the alien transmitter to send a message back to the aliens with her device that she had. And the aliens would then make contact, and the ultimate sort of reveal was that there are Fees, characters like her, beings like her, on every habitable planet all over the universe, and they are all similarly motivated. They are all trying to make this contact with the spirit world, and they have all sort of arisen at the same time all over the universe because there's something evil in the spirit world that ultimately needs to be banished. And that leads Fee eventually through, with the help of the Will-o'-the-Wisp, Brickru, that leads Fee through, in my mind, was a scene that was where you realize that the song "In the Darkness is the Light" is actually a literal Molly premonition of what Fee would go through, that she walks through fire, she walks through ice. And those things were metaphorical in that song for Molly's struggle to get sober, but that it was also a premonition of actual things that she would do, and she would walk into the afterlife in some sense. And then Lee and I would fight it out and decide whether she got to bring her father back from the afterlife, or whether it would just be, some sort of ultimately emotional, satisfying connection and ending, some righting of the wrong that had been done by taking her dad too early. I was totally on the side of bringing him back, of reincorporealizing, or whatever word you would want to use for that it was actually wrong. That was kind of the point of Banshee, especially the original version of Banshee, that Fee was willing to give up her years of her own life to keep her grandfather alive, and Disney was not okay with that. And one of the few times they ever kind of put their foot down about stuff like that. And so I made it more of a bargaining chip that, she was arguing that her father had been taken unfairly and that wasn't right and that they should do something nice for her by letting her grandfather be alive. And that's how that episode resolved itself. And so there were clearly forces in the universe that agreed with her. If there's some tribunal out there in the afterlife that's sort of judging the rights and wrongs of the way things were done, that some evil force had taken Rick before he even died in the car crash, and that was wrong and really should be rectified. So, whether that would have been a good idea or not, I don't know. But that's the way I leaned, was actually bringing him back to life. But they ultimately focused on the light comedic stuff. And so they found So Weird just didn't fit what what they felt their brand was. They tried to lighten it up in the third season, and that, from what I'm told, had mixed results. We had an amazing journey in the whole thing. Like it was very tough for me when we got separated from the show, which is not a unique experience. That happens to pretty much everybody on the show. So, but it was my first time really, and I was really deeply emotionally involved with those characters. They had become very real to me. That universe had become very real to me. It was not a problem to write because it was just like, okay, well, here they are and they're going to talk now. And, then the cast members would periodically call up and say, it's so different. And we'd be like, please don't talk to me. Don't tell me. I don't want to know. For me, it was a bit of a lesson in to maintain a little bit more emotional distance from the characters because, inside I'm still the same 7-year-old, right? I still make up stories in my head and write them down. And, it was a very emotional experience. And we were, Mac and I and my wife, my ex-wife, were very close. Like it was a family. And we were, Belinda and Squatch, we were really lucky to be with the people that we were with. There was a theme for the show that I never put in anything. And I ended up actually writing it in a song for my nephew who lives in England. And because he's quite shy and he was struggling. And so I wrote a song that has the actual theme in it, which is life is messy, stick together. And that was always the theme behind the family show, that nothing ever goes right. Nothing is ever perfect. And if you stick together, you'll get through it. It doesn't mean it'll be great at the end. It doesn't mean anything will be fixed at the end. It just means you'll get through it.
Sun's up, start the day, shower first, push and shove to get my way, a price to pay, but it rains down, wash away all my cares, what's happening in the day, might come my way. Messy, stick together. School's in, duty calls, pressure's on. Leave the sun outside these walls, these crowded halls. Be the best, be the brightest. Don't be brittle in the slightest. Be the strongest and the kindest. How can I ever find this? But I remember, whatever the weather, life is messy, stick together. School's out, time to fly, see my mates, play my games and try to hide what's deep inside. But love calls all the while, it's all